The most dangerous mistake isn't breaking the law. It's assuming you already know who deserves its protection. The marble steps of the state Supreme Court rose into the cool morning air like a promise carved in stone, reflecting the first rays of sunlight across the broad plaza where attorneys hurried toward security checkpoints, reporters adjusted camera equipment, and visitors quietly waited for the doors to open. Every movement seemed ordinary, every conversation blended into the familiar rhythm of another busy day inside one of the state's most respected institutions. Among the crowd walked a woman whose calm presence drew almost no attention at all. Dressed in a simple navy suit with a leather briefcase resting comfortably at her side, Naomi Brooks moved with quiet confidence, neither rushing nor seeking notice. She greeted an elderly maintenance worker with a warm smile, thanked a courthouse volunteer for holding the entrance gate, and continued toward the front steps with the steady composure of someone who never measured her worth by whether strangers recognized her face. To everyone watching, she appeared to be another attorney arriving early for an important hearing. No expensive escort, no flashing lights, no public display of authority. Just another black woman making her way into a government building. Standing near the security perimeter was Officer Ethan Walker, a white patrol officer whose sharp eyes constantly searched for anything he considered unusual. Years of routine had convinced him that his instincts rarely failed, and that confidence had quietly grown into something far more dangerous than caution. The moment he noticed Naomi approaching, his attention locked onto her with unsettling certainty. Without waiting for any sign of wrongdoing, he stepped directly into her path, forcing her to stop before reaching the courthouse entrance. "Hold it," he said firmly, extending one hand. "Where do you think you're going?" Several nearby visitors slowed their pace, curious enough to watch but unwilling to interrupt. Naomi met his eyes with remarkable calm. "Good morning, officer," she replied politely. "I'm here for work." Her voice carried neither irritation nor fear. It was measured, respectful, almost comforting. But her composure only seemed to deepen his suspicion. "Work?" he asked with a skeptical smile. "You're going to need to do better than that." He motioned toward her briefcase. "Set it down." Naomi complied without argument, placing the briefcase gently beside her polished shoes. Around them, conversations faded into whispers. A television cameraman instinctively shifted his lens toward the unfolding exchange while courthouse employees exchanged uncertain glances from the top of the stairs. Something about the moment felt strangely off, though no one could explain exactly why. Ethan folded his arms and studied her identification without saying a word, his expression growing more confident with every passing second, as though silence itself confirmed whatever conclusion he had already reached. Naomi remained perfectly still. She never raised her voice. She never challenged his authority. Instead, she simply waited, her steady eyes revealing a patience that seemed almost impossible under the circumstances. Then, somewhere across the plaza, a barely noticeable voice crackled through an unseen earpiece. A black SUV eased quietly toward the curb. 3 men in tailored suits looked up almost simultaneously. None of them hurried. None of them spoke. But every one of them had suddenly fixed their attention on the woman standing alone at the foot of the courthouse steps. Officer Walker never noticed. He believed he still controlled the moment. He had no idea that within seconds, the entire scene was about to belong to someone else. Officer Ethan Walker slowly looked over the identification card without handing it back, his expression carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone convinced he had already figured out the entire story. Around them, the courthouse plaza continued to breathe with its usual rhythm, but more and more people found subtle reasons to linger. A young law clerk paused beside a stone column while pretending to answer a telephone call. 2 newspaper photographers adjusted their camera straps without taking a single picture. Even the courthouse security officers standing inside. The entrants exchanged brief glances before returning to their posts, uncertain whether this was simply another routine encounter or the beginning of something far more unusual. Naomi Brooks remained exactly where she stood, her posture relaxed, her shoulders level, and her eyes focused calmly on the officer before her. She had spent an entire career understanding that authority often revealed its true character not during moments of comfort, but during moments when patience was tested. She understood something else as well. Every unnecessary word had the power either to calm a situation or quietly feed it. That morning, silence carried greater strength than argument. Ethan finally spoke again. "You said you work here. What exactly do you do?" His tone was polite enough to avoid open confrontation, yet skeptical enough to make everyone nearby understand that he did not believe her answer would satisfy him. Naomi answered with the same measured voice. "I have responsibilities inside the courthouse." Ethan tilted his head slightly. "That is not much of an answer." He looked past her toward the grand entrance before returning his attention to her face. People with important jobs usually identify themselves immediately. Naomi gave a faint, respectful smile. Sometimes the work matters more than the title. Her response seemed only to deepen his confidence that she was avoiding a direct explanation. He stepped to the side, preventing her from continuing toward the building while carefully maintaining professional distance. "Until I know exactly who you are, nobody is walking through those doors." A quiet murmur drifted across the plaza. Some observers appeared uncomfortable. Others simply watched with curiosity, trying to understand why a woman who had remained calm from the very beginning was still being delayed despite offering complete cooperation. Naomi did not glance toward the growing audience. She simply folded her hands in front of her briefcase and waited. It was a kind of patience that could not be taught in a single courtroom or earned through a single victory. It came from years of listening before speaking, observing before judging, and remembering. That dignity was often preserved through restraint rather than reaction. High above the courthouse entrance, an American flag moved gently in the morning breeze. Its quiet motion contrasted sharply with the invisible tension spreading across the plaza. A courthouse employee exited through the revolving doors carrying a stack of legal files. The moment he noticed Naomi standing below, his steps slowed almost imperceptibly before he turned away without saying a word, as though he had received an unspoken instruction to let events unfold naturally. Across the street, the black sport utility vehicle completed its approach and stopped near the curb with remarkable precision. The engine remained running. One suited man adjusted his earpiece while another discreetly scanned the surrounding sidewalks. Their movements were disciplined, almost invisible to anyone not paying close attention. Ethan never looked in their direction. His attention remained fixed entirely on the woman standing before him. He believed this encounter was still his to control. Naomi simply lifted her eyes toward the courthouse clock as its hands reached the top of the hour. Somewhere nearby, a barely audible voice spoke through concealed communication equipment. "Principal has arrived." Naomi Brooks heard the quiet transmission long before anyone else noticed that anything had changed, yet her expression remained completely unchanged. The words carried through an unseen communication device somewhere across the plaza, but they were not intended for the crowd. They were simply confirmation that every movement, every conversation, and every unexpected delay had already been observed. Officer Ethan Walker, however, heard nothing except his own assumptions. He handed Naomi's identification card back with deliberate slowness before taking another careful look at her face, as though searching for a reason to justify the uncertainty beginning to creep into his thoughts. Instead of stepping aside, he asked another question. "Who exactly are you meeting inside?" Naomi answered with the same calm tone she had maintained from the beginning. "People who are expecting me." The response frustrated him. Sounded truthful, yet revealed almost nothing. He exhaled quietly and glanced toward the courthouse entrance where the first wave of attorneys had already disappeared inside. "You are making this much harder than it needs to be," he said. "If you have nothing to hide, then tell me exactly why you are here." Naomi looked toward the courthouse for only a brief second before returning her attention to him. "Because my work requires me to be there." Once again, the answer offered no title, no credentials, and no invitation for special treatment. Around them, the gathering crowd continued to grow. Some people whispered that the officer was simply doing his job. Others quietly wondered why the conversation had lasted so long when the woman had remained respectful from the very first moment. A middle-aged attorney lowered his briefcase and watched from several yards away. A court reporter stopped writing in her notebook, sensing that something unusual was unfolding before the doors even opened. Ethan noticed the growing audience and unconsciously straightened his posture. Being observed made him even more determined to prove that his judgment had been correct all along. "Open your briefcase, please," he requested. Naomi did not argue. She placed the case on a nearby stone bench and carefully released the locks. Inside were neatly organized legal documents, a leather notebook, reading glasses, and several folders marked with official court seals. Everything appeared orderly, professional, and entirely consistent with someone conducting important legal work. Ethan studied the contents without touching them. Nothing looked suspicious. In fact, everything seemed surprisingly ordinary. Yet instead of ending the encounter, he searched for another reason to continue. "Those documents could belong to anyone," he said. Naomi gently closed the briefcase. "That is true." Her answer was so composed that it became almost impossible to provoke a different reaction. Imagine standing there while someone kept searching for reasons to doubt you, not because of anything you had done, but because they had already decided who you must be before asking a single honest question. Sometimes, the greatest test of character is not proving who you are. It is refusing to let someone else's assumptions define your dignity. Across the plaza, the rear door of the black sport utility vehicle opened almost silently. A man in a tailored charcoal suit stepped onto the sidewalk, his eyes calmly scanning the surroundings without drawing attention to himself. Two others followed several seconds later, each maintaining enough distance to appear unrelated while remaining perfectly coordinated. Their pace was steady, their expressions unreadable, and their focus never drifted far from the woman standing beside the courthouse steps. Officer Walker still did not notice them. He believed he was asking one more routine question. In reality, the next few moments were already moving beyond his control. Officer Ethan Walker folded his arms once again, convinced that patience would eventually expose whatever story he believed was hiding beneath Naomi Brooks's quiet confidence. The courthouse clock continued marking the passing minutes, and with every second the morning crowd became noticeably larger. Lawyers carrying leather portfolios walked more slowly than before. Court employees paused at the top of the granite staircase before disappearing through the entrance. Visitors waiting for hearings exchanged uncertain looks, sensing that something unusual was unfolding in plain sight. Yet the woman standing in the center of everyone's attention showed no sign of frustration. Naomi simply rested one hand lightly on the handle of her briefcase and allowed the silence to settle naturally between each question. There was something remarkably steady about her presence, something that made the growing tension seem almost one-sided. Ethan cleared his throat before speaking again. "You have had several opportunities to explain yourself," Naomi answered without hesitation. "I have answered every question you have asked." The response was completely accurate, but it was not the answer he wanted. "You keep answering without actually saying anything," he replied, allowing a trace of impatience to enter his voice. Naomi looked directly at him. "Sometimes people hear only what they expect to hear." The words were delivered without sarcasm, yet they lingered in the air longer than either of them expected. A young assistant district attorney standing nearby quietly lowered the coffee cup in her hand. An elderly man waiting to serve on a jury slowly removed his reading glasses, unable to look away from the conversation. Even those who had initially assumed this would end within moments now sensed that every additional question was pushing the situation further away from routine. Ethan reached toward his shoulder microphone and quietly informed dispatch that he was conducting an extended identification inquiry. His report sounded calm and professional, but beneath the measured words was an unmistakable determination to prove that delaying the woman had been justified. Dispatch acknowledged the transmission without asking further questions. Across the plaza, the three individuals in tailored suits continued their gradual approach, never drawing attention to themselves. One stopped briefly beside a newspaper stand. Another appeared to check the time on his watch. The third glanced toward the courthouse entrance before making subtle eye contact with courthouse security personnel already positioned inside the building. No hurried movements, no visible concern. Everything unfolded with remarkable discipline. Naomi noticed every detail without turning her head. Years of experience had taught her that true professionals rarely needed dramatic gestures to communicate. Officer Walker remained completely unaware. His focus never left the woman before him. "I still do not understand why someone with important business would arrive alone," he remarked. Naomi smiled politely. Appearances often tell incomplete stories. The answer frustrated him even more because it sounded less like a defense and more like quiet wisdom. Imagine standing there while someone continued searching for evidence that simply did not exist, refusing to consider that the first impression might have been wrong. Pride has a way of narrowing a person's vision until certainty replaces curiosity. And once that happens, even the clearest truth can remain invisible. The courthouse doors opened. Again, as several senior judges entered through a separate secured entrance, hidden from most public view. None of them glanced toward the growing crowd outside. Yet one courthouse administrator suddenly paused after receiving a brief message through a discreet earpiece. His expression changed almost instantly. He looked toward the plaza, recognized the woman waiting calmly below, and then looked toward the approaching men in charcoal suits. Without saying a single word, he stepped aside and held the secure entrance open. The moment was so subtle that almost nobody noticed it. Almost nobody except the people who already knew exactly who Naomi Brooks was. The quiet shift in the atmosphere was almost impossible to explain unless you knew exactly what to look for. Nothing dramatic happened. No alarms sounded. No voices were raised. Yet the entire courthouse plaza seemed to breathe differently, as though an invisible current had begun moving beneath the ordinary rhythm of the morning. Officer Ethan Walker remained convinced that he was only moments away from uncovering an inconsistency. Every answer Naomi Brooks had given sounded truthful, but because it did not fit the story he had already constructed in his mind, he continued searching for something that would justify keeping her where she stood. He glanced once more at the identification card before returning it to her with deliberate care. "I still think there is something you are not telling me," he said. Naomi accepted the card with a calm smile and placed it inside her briefcase. "There is a difference between withholding information and answering the questions that have been asked," she replied softly. "I have done the second." Ethan frowned. Her words were respectful, yet they quietly challenged the assumptions driving the entire conversation. Nearby, several courthouse employees had begun communicating through subtle gestures rather than spoken words. One clerk briefly looked toward the secure entrance before nodding almost imperceptibly. A uniformed security supervisor touched the microphone hidden beneath his jacket collar, listened for only a second, and then stepped aside without interrupting the encounter. To everyone else, these movements appeared meaningless. To those trained to notice patterns, they formed a silent chain of preparation. The three men in charcoal suits continued closing the distance at an unhurried pace. They did not walk together. Each approached from a different direction, blending naturally into the flow of pedestrians crossing the plaza. One paused to allow an elderly couple to pass before continuing forward. Another briefly held the courthouse door for a young attorney carrying several heavy case files. Their professionalism was almost invisible because true preparation rarely announces itself. Naomi noticed them through nothing more than reflections in the courthouse windows and the polished surface of a bronze memorial near the entrance. She never acknowledged them directly. She did not need to. Trust built over years required no eye contact and no spoken confirmation. Ethan shifted his weight and looked toward the growing audience surrounding the scene. He realized more people were watching than before, and the awareness strengthened his determination to finish what he had started. "Until I am completely satisfied," he said. "I would appreciate it if you remained exactly where you are." Naomi nodded politely. "I have not attempted to leave." Once again, her answer carried neither resistance nor frustration. Imagine standing quietly while someone mistakes your patience for uncertainty and your courtesy for weakness. Sometimes people believe they hold power simply because another person chooses not to argue. They never consider that restraint may come from confidence rather than fear. A cool breeze swept across the wide stone steps, gently lifting the edge of Naomi's jacket as the courthouse bell marked another passing minute. At almost the exact same moment, The lead man in the charcoal suit slowed his pace and lightly touched the discreet communication device hidden behind his ear. His voice was barely above a whisper. Visual confirmation complete. Principal remains stationary. An equally calm reply came almost instantly. Protective detail authorized to approach. Officer Walker heard none of it. He took one small step closer, believing he was still directing the encounter. In reality, the final seconds before everything changed had already begun to count down. The lead man in the charcoal suit closed the final few yards with calm, deliberate steps that carried neither urgency nor hesitation. His two colleagues adjusted their positions with practiced precision, each naturally creating space around Naomi Brooks without alarming the growing crowd. To most people watching, they looked like professionals arriving for an important meeting. Only those paying close attention noticed the quiet synchronization in every movement. Officer Ethan Walker finally shifted his attention away from Naomi long enough to notice the strangers approaching. His expression tightened immediately. "This area is restricted," he said, raising one hand. "Please remain where you are." The lead man acknowledged him with a courteous nod but never slowed his pace. He stopped beside Naomi, maintaining a respectful distance before speaking in a calm, unmistakably professional voice. "Good morning, Justice Brooks." The words seemed to suspend the entire plaza in silence. Conversations stopped in mid-sentence. A lawyer halfway up the courthouse steps froze with one foot on the next stair. Even the television cameraman instinctively lowered his equipment as though he had suddenly realized he was witnessing something much larger than an ordinary security check. Naomi turned toward the man with the same composed smile she had worn since arriving. "Good morning, Daniel," she replied. "Thank you." There was no surprise in her voice because none of this was unexpected. Daniel gave a slight nod before speaking quietly into the communication device concealed beneath his jacket collar. "Principal confirmed." Almost instantly, the remaining members of the protective detail adjusted their positions with remarkable discipline, creating an unobtrusive security perimeter that appeared almost effortless. There were no dramatic gestures, no raised voices, and no unnecessary displays of authority. Their professionalism rested in how little attention they drew while ensuring that every possible concern had already been addressed. Officer Walker stared at Naomi, then back at Daniel, clearly trying to process what he had just heard. "Justice?" he repeated, almost under his breath. Daniel reached inside his jacket and presented official state credentials. "Protective Services Division," he said respectfully. "We are assigned to Justice Naomi Brooks of the State Supreme Court." Ethan accepted the identification with noticeably slower hands than before. His confidence, so steady only moments earlier, began giving way to uncertainty. He looked toward Naomi again, searching her face for some sign that this was a misunderstanding. Instead, he found the same calm expression that had never changed from the beginning. She had never argued. She had never demanded special treatment. She had never announced her title. She had simply answered every question placed before her with honesty and dignity. Around the plaza, courthouse officials immediately recognized the situation. The administrator standing near the secured entrance walked briskly toward the group, removing his glasses as he approached. "Good morning, Justice Brooks," he said warmly. "We have been expecting you. The full court is assembled." Naomi acknowledged him with a gracious smile. "Thank you. I apologize if my arrival has caused any delay." Imagine standing there and realizing that the person you believed needed to prove her place had never needed your approval to belong there at all. Sometimes respect is revealed not by titles announced, but by the quiet confidence of those who never feel compelled to announce them. Officer Walker slowly lowered his hands. The courthouse around him had not changed. The marble steps, the American flag, the waiting attorneys, and the morning sunlight all remained exactly as they had been only minutes earlier. The only thing that had changed was his understanding of the woman standing before him, and with that realization came the unmistakable awareness that the encounter was no longer defined by assumptions, but by the truth that had been patiently waiting to reveal itself. Officer Ethan Walker remained silent as the meaning of the last few moments settled over the courthouse plaza. The certainty, that had guided every question now seemed strangely distant, replaced by an uncomfortable awareness that hundreds of eyes were no longer watching Naomi Brooks. They were watching him. The quiet conversations that had stopped only moments before slowly returned, but their tone had changed completely. People were no longer wondering why the woman had been delayed. They were wondering how someone so composed had remained patient through every unnecessary question without once mentioning the position she held. Daniel accepted his credentials back from Officer Walker with the same professional courtesy he had shown from the beginning. There was no triumph in his expression and no attempt to embarrass anyone. His responsibility was simple: protect the justice, maintain order, allow the institution to continue functioning with dignity. Naomi gently lifted her briefcase from the stone bench and thanked him with a small nod. Before she could continue toward the courthouse entrance, another familiar voice echoed across the plaza. Justice Brooks. The Chief Marshal of the State Supreme Court descended the granite steps accompanied by the court administrator and two senior officials. Their pace was steady, their expressions respectful. The Chief Marshal extended his hand warmly. "The full panel is ready, Your Honor. We were becoming concerned when we received word that you had been delayed outside." Naomi returned the greeting with quiet grace. "Thank you. There is no need for concern. Everything can be resolved respectfully." Those words reached far beyond the small group gathered near the entrance. Several courthouse employees exchanged thoughtful glances. A young law student standing near the security checkpoint quietly lowered his notebook after realizing he had just witnessed a lesson that no classroom could fully teach. Across the plaza, one of the television crews finally raised a camera, not to capture conflict, but simply to document the arrival of one of the state's highest judicial officers. Officer Walker instinctively took one step backward, creating the space he should have offered from the beginning. At that exact moment, his shoulder radio crackled. Supervisor arriving on scene. Within less than a minute, Lieutenant Robert Hayes crossed the plaza with measured urgency. He acknowledged Naomi first with professional respect before turning toward Ethan. "Officer Walker," he said calmly, "I will take it from here." There was no public lecture and no dramatic confrontation. Professionalism demanded something better. Lieutenant Hayes requested Ethan's body-worn camera according to department procedure and quietly asked another officer to preserve any available security footage covering the courthouse entrance. Several witnesses who had observed the entire interaction were politely invited to remain available if their statements became necessary. Every step followed established policy. Every action reflected accountability rather than emotion. Imagine discovering that the smallest decisions made during an ordinary morning can become the moments that define an entire career. Not because someone sought revenge, but because integrity leaves a record that pride cannot rewrite. Naomi watched the process for only a brief moment before speaking softly to Lieutenant Hayes. "Please remember that fairness belongs to everyone involved." The lieutenant nodded respectfully. "Yes, Your Honor." She offered one final courteous glance toward Officer Walker. There was no anger in her eyes, only quiet disappointment that an encounter which could have ended with simple courtesy had instead become a reminder of why humility remains one of the most important qualities anyone entrusted with authority can possess. With that, Naomi turned toward the courthouse entrance, accompanied by her protective detail, while the great bronze doors opened to receive the woman who had never needed to announce her importance because her character had spoken long before anyone recognized her title. The heavy bronze doors closed quietly behind Justice Naomi Brooks, but the conversation she had left outside continued to echo throughout the courthouse long before the morning docket officially began. Inside the grand hallway, attorneys who had witnessed the event spoke in low voices, not because they enjoyed discussing another person's mistake, but because everyone understood they had seen something far more significant than an ordinary misunderstanding. They had watched patience confront assumption, and they had watched dignity remain steady under pressure. Naomi walked through the marble corridors with the same calm pace she had maintained since arriving that morning. Court staff greeted her respectfully, yet she acknowledged every person with equal warmth, from the newest clerk organizing files to the senior judges preparing for oral arguments. Her title had never changed the way she treated people. Perhaps that was why so many inside the courthouse admired her long before they learned from legal opinions carrying her signature. As she entered her chambers, Daniel quietly confirmed that the protective detail had secured the building and that all scheduled proceedings could continue normally. Naomi thanked him before setting her briefcase on the polished oak desk overlooking the city skyline. Through the tall windows, the courthouse plaza appeared peaceful once again, almost as though the morning encounter had never happened. Yet she knew better. Moments like that did not simply disappear. They became lessons, depending on whether people were willing to learn from them. A gentle knock sounded at her office door. Lieutenant Robert Hayes entered respectfully after receiving permission. "Your Honor," he began, "I wanted to personally apologize for the delay you experienced this morning." Naomi invited him to sit before answering. "Lieutenant, apologies have value only when they are followed by understanding." Hayes nodded thoughtfully. "The department has already begun reviewing every recording and witness statement according to policy." Naomi folded her hands calmly. "That is appropriate. But I would ask for something more important." He looked at her attentively. "What would that be?" She paused for a brief moment before answering. "Do not make this about one officer alone. Ask whether your systems encourage people to observe carefully before reaching conclusions. Ask whether every citizen who walks toward a courthouse receives the same measure of dignity, regardless of how familiar they appear." Her words carried no accusation. They sounded more like an invitation to improve than a demand to punish. Lieutenant Hayes remained silent for several seconds before quietly responding. "I understand." "I hope you do," Naomi said gently, "because trust in justice is not built only inside a courtroom. It begins outside these doors, in the smallest interactions that most people never remember. For someone else, this morning might have ended very differently. Imagine walking into a public building believing the law exists equally for everyone, only to discover that first impressions still shape how respect is offered. Then imagine responding not with anger, but with enough grace to remind an entire institution what justice is supposed to look like. That kind of strength rarely makes headlines, yet it changes people who are willing to pay attention." As Lieutenant Hayes prepared to leave, Naomi offered one final request. "When your review is complete, I hope the outcome strengthens confidence rather than fear. Accountability should never exist to humiliate. It should exist to help every public servant become worthy of the authority entrusted to them." Hayes stood and nodded respectfully. "I will remember those words, Your Honor." After he departed, Naomi gathered the case files waiting for that morning's session and quietly walked toward the courtroom, ready to fulfill the responsibility she had carried for years, knowing that true justice was measured not by the power to judge others, but by the wisdom to treat every person with fairness before judgment was ever required. The courtroom settled into a respectful silence as Justice Naomi Brooks took her seat beneath the great seal of the state, her expression as composed as it had been from the moment she first stepped onto the courthouse plaza that morning. The attorneys rose together, the spectators followed, and the familiar words announcing the opening of the session echoed through the chamber with quiet dignity. Looking around the room, no one could have guessed that only a short time earlier she had been standing outside answering questions with extraordinary patience instead of announcing who she was. She reviewed the first case with the same careful attention she gave every matter before the court, listening thoughtfully, asking measured questions, and treating every attorney with equal respect regardless of reputation or experience. Justice, she believed, could never depend upon appearances. It depended upon facts, fairness, and the willingness to listen before reaching conclusions. Outside the courtroom, Officer Ethan Walker sat alone in a small administrative office while the standard review process quietly began. His body-worn camera footage, courthouse security recordings, and witness statements would all become part of an objective evaluation conducted according to established policy. No voices were raised. No one celebrated his discomfort. Accountability did not require humiliation to have meaning. As he replayed the morning in his own mind, he remembered every calm answer Naomi had given, every opportunity she had offered him to slow down, and every assumption he had made before truly understanding the person standing in front of him. For the first time that day, he realized that authority alone had never guaranteed good judgment. Later that afternoon, Lieutenant Robert Hayes gathered several officers for a brief discussion before the next shift began. He did not single out names or repeat rumors. Instead, he spoke about observation, professionalism, and the responsibility that came with every badge. He reminded them that every encounter begins with another human being, not with an assumption, and that public confidence is earned one respectful conversation at a time. Several younger officers listened with unusual attention because they understood that the lesson extended far beyond a single morning outside one courthouse. Word of the incident gradually spread through legal circles across the state. But the story people remembered most was not that a distinguished justice had been delayed on her way to court. It was that she had responded with patience instead of pride and with wisdom instead of anger. Her conduct became an example discussed in law schools, judicial seminars, and community meetings where people asked what true leadership should look like. When dignity is tested, imagine standing in front of someone whose title could change your entire future, only to discover that the greatest power they possess is the choice to treat you with fairness even after you have misunderstood them. That is the kind of strength no uniform, robe, or official office can create by itself. It comes from character built over a lifetime. As the evening sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of the courthouse, the plaza looked exactly as it had at sunrise, welcoming lawyers, visitors, employees, and ordinary citizens alike. Yet for those who had witnessed the events of that day, the place would never feel quite the same again because they had learned a simple truth that reaches far beyond any courtroom. A badge may grant authority, a title may command respect, but character is what determines how both are used. And on that ordinary morning, justice did not announce itself with power. It revealed itself through patience, humility, and the quiet courage to see every person before judging who they are.